Hello everyone, my name is Scott Leadingham. I am the NWPB News Manager. Thank you for joining us on our weekly news roundup. I am joined in the studio by Esmy Jimenez, who is the Yakima Valley correspondent for NWPB. Hello Esmy and welcome.
Hi Scott, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here and talk about some community news that's happening.
So Esmy is normally in Yakima because that's where she's based and that's part of her title, but she's joining us here in our Pullman studios today. And Esmy, I'm first going to ask you a kind of a personal question, I suppose, is what's it like being back in the area, in the Yakima Valley, where you grew up and now you're living and working in a place that you're so connected to?
That's a great question, Scott. I think it's been quite an experience to return because I went to school in LA and went and studied different topics beyond just like traditional journalism, and to come back to the community where I grew up, I remember swimming in the Yakima River. I remember running through a lot of the cherry fields and seeing my community live and grow there, and now being able to report on the topics that are really important, specifically hot topic issues like immigration, like climate change, has been a really powerful experience in terms of accessing the local knowledge that's there, checking in with the right people to tell their own stories, and then being able to share it with the rest of the Northwest. So it's been really awesome.
So talking about big issues and big stories in the Yakima Valley, there's definitely a big one in the last several months involving the Rattlesnake Ridge landslide. At first, what we thought would be this big kind of possible natural disaster. The New York Times even came and wrote about it, doing the New York Times thing, kind of coming in, doing a big thing, and then kind of maybe leaving. But from your perspective, who covered that for kind of the long term, and seeing some of the stories that weren't just the big stories of the day, you've stuck with it. You and Anna King from Tri-Cities did some joint reporting on that. Tell us a little bit more about some of those undercovered stories and some of the continuing coverage that you've been doing.
Absolutely. That was also quite an experience because we heard about this landslide. We were worried, right, is it going to go? How is it going to affect the folks that are living right there? It's right based in Yakima, so you have this whole community watching. And then as we found out more information from the Department of Natural Resources and other organizations that it was going to be slow moving, then the question became kind of like this slow ticking clock of, is the landslide going to go or not? Luckily, we found out it wasn't, but at the end of the story, there's still a lot of human components. So we're looking at the people that are displaced from that landslide. We ended up doing quite a few different stories on housing and the folks that were being impacted from the landslide, because at the end of the day, they were having a place that was their home. Some of them had been there for a decade or more, and then to suddenly be worried, I have to hold my breath and see whether or not this landslide is going to happen. A lot of them were kids who were, waiting for the bus in this Union Gap area right next to the landslide, who were now displaced at a hotel. It was a whole different story. So it has been quite a privilege to be able to follow it through this sequence and seeing, what happens. Because, maybe the New York Times comes and says, there's this landslide happening, right? And then they leave and the story cycle continues. But for folks who are living and being present in that space, the story's not over, right? The landslide was a part of it, but housing is still an issue. Looking at the environmental reasons why that was happening is still a question. Looking at how government agencies are reacting to that news is also really important. So ultimately, it's been really interesting to follow through it and see what's going on, and we're going to keep doing that.
I should say at this point, if anyone is watching the live stream on Facebook, you can comment or ask a question there as we go through, and we'll try to get to that. My one surprising thing that I learned coming out of the reporting that you were doing was that the housing market in the Yakima Valley is actually tighter, lower occupancy rate than Seattle. And we all think of, Seattle is this very hard housing market, but Yakima is shorter. Tell us how you kind of found that and kind of what that meant for the reporting and for the residents.
Yeah, so that was something that was really fascinating to me as well. I had been working on some housing shortages stories that I'd thought about months before the landslide, and so I kept having that in the back of my mind, but I wasn't sure how to develop it further. And so I had fallen back on this interview where I remember his name was Lowell Kruger, I believe, from the Yakima Housing Authority, and he was saying that the rates were lower. And I was like, you're telling me that even though Portland and Seattle get a lot of news coverage on housing shortages. It's worse in the rural communities like Kittitas and Yakima County. And he was like, no, absolutely, there's data for that. And so we followed up through the UW School of Real Estate does like semester analysis of housing markets, and they were looking that they were significantly lower. So 3% is considered like a full market, and Yakima and Kittitas were like 1%, less than 1%, and it's a lot tighter out here because we're not being able to build new things. We're not being able to actually fund a lot of like low-income housing. So in that sense, it was really fascinating to discover, as tight as those markets are in urban areas, they're a lot tighter in rural areas as well.
And that's a long-term problem in the sense of like it's not something that we can address in the next week or month or even year, right? Because that housing takes a long time to get approved and built and all these sorts of things.
Absolutely.
So it's a long-term issue that you're going to be following.
Right. And so like the folks that we were talking about who were displaced from the Rattlesnake Ridge landslide, not only are they looking at a tight housing market, a lot of them were migrant workers, they had temporary or seasonal work, they were low income, so all those factors were kind of piling up against them in terms of being able to find housing to move into.
So another story that not related to housing or the Rattlesnake Ridge, but I thought was very fascinating, really highlights Central Washington and the issues and the people there, is a story you did recently on native dating for members of the Yakima Nation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about that, about how you got that idea and what the implications for the people there on the Yakima Nation about how they have to make considerations in dating that most people probably don't have to think about.
Absolutely. So that story, I wanted to do something for Valentine's Day. I thought it was a really interesting topic, and often in rural communities, we talk about wildfires or we talk about like farming. And I was like, we have normal things that still happen in rural areas as well, and one of those things is dating. And so I had originally gotten the idea from a podcast that we did with Latino USA a year ago, I believe, that was looking at the racial dynamics of the Yakima Nation. And one of the things that stood out to me was folks talking about how difficult it was to date within the Native community. And so I was kind of fascinated, what does that look like? What does that mean? Why is that? And I was actually able to meet with some folks who were vulnerable enough to open up about their stories in terms of dating on the reservation and in the community. And one of the things that came up was just that because they have a limited number of Yakima citizens, what happens is that in order to keep blood quantum at a certain percentage, you have to decide whether or not to avoid dating within a limited community in terms of the people that you date, or dating outside of the community, and then maybe foregoing your children being part of the Yakima Nation and having those tribal rights. And I was like, wait, you're telling me you do that all on a first date? Like, that's a lot of pressure for a first date.
Among all the other pressures.
Exactly. Typically you're like, okay, what am I going to wear? Where are we going to go? And instead you're having to ask on that first date, who's your mom, who's your dad, who's your grandfather, who's your grandmother? Go through that lineage. And through that oral storytelling, find out, is it permissible for me to date this person, or are we maybe related somewhere down the line? And so through that story, I really wanted to be able to showcase the Yakima Nation and a different kind of struggle that they're going through on something like Valentine's Day.
And I mean, you mentioned blood quantum, which is a whole very complex and controversial topic and frankly just phrase within Native communities and what that means and historically. Can you talk just a little bit about what that concept is and why it was initially introduced into
Absolutely.
tribes from the federal government and why it's maybe controversial today?
Right. It's absolutely a difficult topic because it is so painful. It's political, and at the same time it's personal. Blood quantum originates from policies back in the day during colonization when settlers were coming in, and as native land was taken, one of the policies that came out of it was this idea that if you were going to have access to tribal rights and that land and the resources on that land, you would prove you were really native. And in order to prove you were really native, they assumed that if you dated outside of the community, you were not going to be as native. And so this practice is definitely harmful in a lot of communities because there's this idea that you're going to water out the bloodline, and that's really difficult, right? And in opposition to, of course, the one-drop rule, which is so different for the African American and Black community. So if you juxtapose those two policies, you're really able to highlight historically how these two communities were disenfranchised from their own land and their own rights.
The one-drop rule meaning that if you had even one drop of African American blood, you are therefore considered Black by the standards of society and the government.
Right. Whereas if you look at tribal folks, right, they're worried that they're not going to have enough blood. So it's just a very interesting comparison.
quite a fascinating and complex cultural dynamic that happens there in Central Washington. And I wanted to kind of go back to that real quickly. I think you touched on it, that Central Washington and much of the rural West sometimes gets boiled down to wildfires and farms, right? Because that's the two things that drive the economies and the natural disasters. But tell us a little bit more about Central Washington and the dynamics there that often aren't necessarily just how people farm and make money and how people are affected by fires in the summers. Like, what is it about the regions that are often maybe overlooked by the news media writ large?
Right. I think it's often overlooked because it's easy to stereotype certain communities, especially geographically, to this is what we cover about them. Wildfires and like cherry season, maybe wine or something. And unfortunately, when there's natural disasters going on, right? But there's a lot more nuance going in every community. And I think it's been really helpful to actually look at all the different points that are happening, whether that's breaking down farming into the cannabis business, which is taking off in Central Washington, and the policies that many counties are implementing against marijuana farmers, whether that's looking at climate change and how those farmers are actually reacting to drought or water shortages, any other information that we have about fertilizers or runoff contamination. So to me, it's been really cool to be like, okay, so yes, farming is a big component of what we do in this area. And yes, we are impacted by wildfires a lot more than Seattle or Portland are. But what does that really look like in our day-to-day lives? You know, besides those two main topics, what else is going on? And so we're still looking at technology. Bitcoin is huge in areas like Wenatchee, right? So it's really fun to be able to remind folks who are not from this area, there's a lot more going on than you think is actually going on.
Sure. One of those things, switching over to kind of a fun cultural thing that you talked about a lot. I remember we talked about Dia de los Muertos back in October or early November, and the film Coco. And that's obviously big at the moment. It's going to be, it's nominated for an Oscar, which is this weekend. And so talk a little bit about the impact about that movie culturally in your family and with the people that you know in immigrant communities in Central Washington, and why that film was so important, some of the themes that were in that film that maybe weren't seen before.
Absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, like I definitely want to go see it that Thanksgiving weekend. I took my entire family. It was a complete adventure and so much fun. One of the first things that I think of as you're mentioning this is I have a 6-year-old nephew, and sometimes, I mean, he's growing up bicultural, so sometimes he'll speak in English, sometimes he'll speak in Spanish. And when we were at the movie, I remember in the first 5 minutes, he's like, is the entire thing in Spanish? Like, I don't want it to be in Spanish. But it was the first time that I was able to take my adult parents, who mostly speak Spanish, to a movie in the US where it was actually in Spanish and culturally relevant. And over 30 years that they've been here, that was the first time they've seen a movie where they saw themselves, they saw their own culture. So that was really awesome. And the thing is, my nephew, right, by the time we finished the movie, he was singing all the songs in Spanish. He was talking about how he wanted to like get a guitar, how he wanted to learn more music. And so that's the power of representation, right? People do want to see themselves in film and art and music, and it's really, really powerful, especially when young folks are able to see themselves and see that their culture is being valued. So I'm super excited for the Oscars. I really hope they win like Best Animated Film, because I think they really deserve it.
Well, I regret to say I haven't seen it yet, but I promise that I will. I will see Coco, because I hear it's a fantastic movie. Esmy Jimenez, thank you so much for joining us this week. We do this every week on Fridays on Facebook Live, and you can watch it again on our website. Esmy Jimenez is our Yakima Valley correspondent, and you can see and hear her online at nwpb.org or on the radio when she does broadcasts for our radio service. Thank you so much, Esmy.
Thank you, Scott.